16 years ago, Kenyans gave themselves a constitution that was supposed to fundamentally change the relationship between the citizen and the state. Today, August 27th, 2026, Kenya went back to that constitution. But if you watched what happened at the Katiba at 16 celebrations at KICC, you will realize that this was not simply a ceremony to celebrate a document that was promulgated 16 years ago. There was something much bigger happening, because beneath the speeches, the flags, the national anthem, and the celebration, there was very uncomfortable question hanging over the country. 16 years later, how much of the 2010 constitution have we actually lived? And that, to me, is the real story of Katiba at 16. The constitution was promulgated on August 27, 2010, after years of political struggle, public agitation, and demands for a different kind of Kenya. It promised stronger institutions, devolution, protection of fundamental rights, public participation, and limits on the exercise of political power. It was not merely a legal document. It was supposed to be a new social contract between Kenyans and their government. And today, President William Ruto led the National Katiba Day celebrations at the Kenyatta International Convention Center, 1 year after the government began formally observing August 27th as Katiba Day. But listen carefully to what President Ruto said. He argued that an electoral mandate gives a government democratic legitimacy and the responsibility to implement the program on which it was elected. But he also acknowledged something extremely important: that mandate operates within constitutional limits. In other words, winning an election does not give a government unlimited power. That distinction is at the heart of Kenya's constitutional experiment. A government can say we were elected, but the constitution can still say there are things you cannot do. And that is precisely why the judiciary, parliament, and independent commissions, the media, civil society, and ordinary citizens matter. Ruto also made the argument that perhaps the constitution should ultimately be judged not by speeches in Nairobi, but by what an ordinary Kenyan experiences every day. Does the constitution mean anything to a mother struggling to access health care? Does it mean anything to a young person looking for employment? Does it mean anything to a family living without adequate housing, food, water, or social protection? Does it mean anything to a citizen who wants to peacefully demonstrate against government policy? Those questions matter because Article 43 of the Constitution guarantees economic and social rights, while Article 37 protects the rights to assemble, demonstrate, picket, and present petitions peacefully and unarmed. So when we talk about constitutional implementation, we cannot only talk about institutions. We have to talk about people's lives. And that is where the Katiba at 16 conversation becomes much more complicated. Deputy President Kithure Kindiki also struck an interesting tone today. He described the constitution as the software of the nation and pointed to Article 10, which establishes national values and principles of governance. But he also asked the question that perhaps every Kenyan should be asking: have we really remained faithful to the democratic values contained in this constitution? Because Kenya has undoubtedly changed since 2010. Devolution is perhaps the clearest example. 47 county governments fundamentally changed how political and financial power is distributed. Money and decision-making moved closer to communities, and many parts of the country gained the infrastructure and services that would previously have depended entirely on Nairobi. But devolution has also exposed another Kenyan problem. We decentralized power, we did not necessarily decentralize accountability. Counties have become centers of political competition, patronage, and, in some cases, allegations of corruption and weak financial management. So the constitutional question is no longer simply, did we create counties? We did. The other question is, are counties being governed according to the constitutional principles that were supposed to guide them? And then there is the judiciary. One of the strongest features of the 2010 constitution was its attempt to create institutions capable of checking political power. That is why President Ruto's statement today that judicial independence is non-negotiable is significant. He said courts must remain free to interpret the constitution, while also stating that government must obey court orders when its actions are found unlawful. That sounds obvious, but in Kenya it's not a trivial statement. The real test of constitutionalism is not whether leaders praise the judiciary when courts agree with them. The real test comes when a court makes a decision that is politically inconvenient. That is when constitutional principles stop being theory. That is when we discover whether institutions are genuinely independent, and perhaps was nowhere was the tension around constitutional rights more visible today than in the discussion about protests. KNHCR Chairperson Gladys Oganga called for clearer regulation of demonstrations around critical national installations such as Parliament, State House, and judiciary buildings. Her argument was that legitimate constitutional rights can sometimes be exploited by people who want to cause violence, and that Kenya needs clearer boundaries. Now, this is an important conversation because the right to protest is not an unlimited license to destroy property, attack people, or storm protected institutions. But there is another side. A government cannot simply define uncomfortable protest as criminal because it dislikes the message. That is precisely why Article 37 exists. The challenge is finding the constitutional balance between protecting public safety and protecting dissent. And that balance becomes particularly important as Kenya approaches the 2027 political season. Because if the last few years have taught us anything, it is that young Kenyans are much more willing to challenge authority. The Constitution gave them language to do it. It gave them Article 33 on freedom of expression, Article 37 on demonstrations, Article 35 on access to information, and perhaps most importantly, Article 1, which says that sovereign power belongs to the people. That is why I think the most interesting story of Katiba at 16 is not actually President Ruto, it is the Kenyan citizen, because the Constitution was written ultimately for that citizen. And outside KICC today, there were Kenyans and civil society groups marking the occasion in very different ways. Amnesty International Kenya, for example, acknowledged the enormous gains made under the 2010 Constitution but warned about shrinking civic space, human rights concerns, institutional weaknesses, and failures of accountability. The contrast is important. Inside the official celebration, the message is largely about progress and responsibility. Outside it, human rights organizations are asking whether Kenya is actually protecting the freedoms that the Constitution guarantees. But both conversations can be true at the same time. Kenya has made enormous constitutional progress, and Kenya still has enormous constitutional failures. That is not a contradiction, that is the reality of 16 years. And then came another symbolic moment. Former Chief Justice Willy Mutunga declined to attend today's Katiba 16 celebrations despite being selected to receive the Shujaa wa Katiba Award and to be admitted to the role of national heroes. That decision speaks loudly, even without a speech. Mutunga was one of the central figures associated with the implementation of the 2010 Constitution. His absence, therefore, raises a deeper question about how Kenya remembers its constitutional history. Do we celebrate the Constitution as a government achievement, or do we remember that the Constitution emerged from struggles involving ordinary citizens, activists, lawyers, reformers, and political movements that often confronted the state itself? That distinction matters because constitutionalism cannot belong to one administration. It cannot belong to Ruto, it cannot belong to Raila, it cannot belong to Uhuru, it cannot belong to the judiciary. It belongs to Kenyans. And perhaps that is the biggest lesson at Katiba at 16. 16 years after 2010, Kenya does not have a constitutional problem because the document is weak. In many ways, the document is remarkably strong. Our problem is implementation. We have a constitution that says Power belongs to the people, but sometimes citizens feel powerless. We have a constitution that demands integrity from public officers, but corruption remains deeply embedded in the public life. We have a constitution that guarantees economic and social rights, but millions still struggle with basic necessities. We have a constitution that protects peaceful protest, but the boundaries between dissent, policing, and public security remain fiercely contested. We have institutions designed to check each other, but political pressure continues to test their independence. So perhaps we should stop asking whether the 2010 constitution has succeeded or failed. That question is too simple. The better question is who is implementing it, who is resisting it, and who is benefiting from it, because a constitution does not enforce in itself. Courts do, parliament does, the executive does, independent commissions do, and ultimately citizens do. 16 years ago, Kenyans changed the rules of the game. Today we are discovering that changing the rules was only the beginning. The real struggle is making powerful people obey those rules when obedience is inconvenient. As, and as Kenya moves towards 2027, that may become the single most important constitutional test of all. So Katiba at 16 should not simply be a birthday celebration. It should be an audit of power, an audit of institutions, an audit of rights, and perhaps most importantly, an audit of ourselves. Because the question is no longer whether Kenya has a good constitution, we know it does. The question is whether Kenya has the political courage to live by it, and that is where the real story of Katiba at 16 begins.